So, good afternoon. Welcome to COMM 125, 225. This course focuses on how news is produced, distributed, and financially supported in the United States. We're going to be focusing on current controversies, on current puzzles, and the goal is to help you figure out how are stories discovered, how are they produced, how are they distributed, how are they funded, and what is their impact. If you come away with an answer to those questions by the end of 10 weeks, then this will have been successful. So the class is called Perspectives on American Journalism, and that really begs the question, what is journalism? There's a really excellent book, Elements of Journalism, by Kovac and Rosenstiel, and what they tried to do is give you a description about what journalism is. And that description is really a combination of is and ought, or if you've had economics, it's a combination of positive and normative. It's really a combination of how the world is working and how they'd like to see the world working. So what Kovac and Rosenstiel did in the Elements of Journalism is they tried to write down what they thought were guidelines or essentials if you were looking at content and trying to say, is that journalism? So what they came up with was a list. Number one, they said journalism, its first obligation is to the truth. So what they're trying to do is set out a set of guidelines or roadmaps that they think journalists operate by, and they think will help you recognize if something is truly journalism. They said that when journalists look at content, the first loyalty is to citizens. So the obligation is to truth, the loyalty is to citizens. They say that journalism involves the discipline of verification. Verification. So again, what are they trying to do? Trying to describe to you what a journalist does and how you could recognize that in operation. So far we've got truth, loyalty to citizens, a discipline of verification. They say that you need to maintain independence from those that you cover. That a journalist tries to maintain independence from the people that she is covering. They say that journalists should be an independent monitor of those in power, an independent monitor of those in power. Journalism should provide a forum for public criticism. It should strive to make points interesting and relevant. The practitioners should exercise their personal conscience. And that citizens have rights and responsibilities when it comes to the news. So again, what are they trying to do? They're trying to say this is how journalists operate and this is how we can recognize journalism. You have an obligation to the truth, your loyalty is to citizens, you're involved in verification, you need to be independent of the people you cover, you need to monitor those in power, give a forum for public criticism, be interesting and relevant, exercise your personal conscience, and remember that citizens have rights and responsibilities. We're living in an era when every hour people contest what journalists do. So if you look at these are the elements of journalism. Who would disagree? Or why might one of those statements be controversial? Let's take them step by step. Obligation to to tell the truth. Why is that controversial today? 12:05, Tuesday, first week of the quarter. Why is that controversial? Yeah?
Because we have tabloids.
Tabloids, exactly. So why did that come to mind?
Just because, it's like with things like the National Enquirer, they have like ridiculous sounding headlines and just stories that aren't necessarily thought all the way through and investigated thoroughly.
Excellent. Okay, so when you hear truth, you put in opposition to that potentially tabloids. They might be sensational. They might be trying to get your attention. They might not be totally focused on the truth. And they might be involved in litigation this year. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Because truth can be relative to who is saying it's true.
Yes. So, that is a critique that people offer. What is truth? Can you actually establish what truth is? Stanford has a ways of thinking requirement that helps you answer that question. Some of you have probably had classes on objectivity and truth. There might be some things we could all agree on. I'm wearing shoes today. I think that that could probably be seen as truth. What might be a truth that is more contested? What might be a truth? Yeah.
It's bad to murder people.
Okay, so there's a subjective, yeah, it's bad to murder people. Wasn't expecting that. We have not coordinated, obviously. So that is a subjective statement, yes?
Tax breaks are good for the economy.
Tax breaks are good for the economy. You could get tenure either way on that. So that's, okay, that's a good point. First, loyalty is to citizens. How could that be controversial? First, loyalty is to citizens. Yeah?
Does that mean that journalists have to publish what citizens want to hear or what they need to hear?
Oh, that's great. So you're pointing out loyalty. Is it need to know or want to know? And that's going to be something that's a recurrent refrain in this course if you're a journalist. Are you serving the market? So are you serving a demand? Or are you writing or producing what you think people should hear? And that's something that we are definitely going to spend some time on. So you're raising the question, what is loyalty? How about that word citizen? How could that be controversial? Yeah?
I think most journalism is done within organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So your first loyalty is to your boss.
As an economist, I understand that. So that's an interesting point, that if you are in the market, other people might even say, if I'm in a for-profit company, I have a fiduciary responsibility to my shareholders. Maybe that's my responsibility. So this gets into that question, is or ought? Is this how people actually act or how you think they should act? One other thing that might be relevant here, suppose you were undocumented, because they use the word citizen here. Does that mean, do you want to replace it now? This was in 2001. Would you replace it with resident? Would you put it citizen? There are probably people here from many different countries today. If I asked you, who is your Congress member, would you say, and I actually asked somebody last week who their Congress member was. They were not a US citizen, so they said they didn't have a Congress member. I would argue against that. I think if you're living in this area, you probably do have a Congress member. So show of hands if I said, your Congress member, the Congress member for this building, who knows the Congress member for this building? 1, 2, 3. Who is an undergraduate and knows the Congress member for this building? Yes, who is it? Anna Eshoo, that's correct. And she's been in the news recently over the last couple of weeks. People writing to Anna Eshoo and where those letters go. So yeah, Anna Eshoo is the Congress member. So that's 1 out of 50 people who know that. We're going to be talking a little bit later about what people do and don't know in politics. But you've raised great points, what it means to be loyalty, citizen. Verification. What would that mean for journalism? Verification. Where could that be controversial? Yeah?
I don't know about controversial.
Great, okay, so fact checking. So you're checking what other people have said. Also, more recently, are you being transparent with your audience? So can they check you? If you're doing data journalism, did you put your code on GitHub? Is your data on GitHub? Verification. Suppose I said, I've got a 35-page document which is really interesting about Russia. I can't verify everything in it, but people are talking about it in Washington, D.C. So I might put it up on Document Cloud and have the world look at it. What am I talking about there? Who faced that decision? Yeah.
WikiLeaks?
Actually, this was anybody else? If I said, what Friends character are you? What outlet is that?
BuzzFeed.
Exactly, BuzzFeed. Okay, so BuzzFeed had the Steele dossier, right? A 35-page document about alleged investigations into candidate and then President Trump. And the editor, well, he said he couldn't verify everything. And that document was circulating in different parts of DC. He made the decision to publish it. And why did he do that? Why would you have something that you couldn't verify everything in? Yes?
And do you believe it's part of the loyalty of the citizens to have that information even though you're incapable of verifying it?
Okay, yeah, yes.
Because they made it clear that they couldn't verify it. They were like, hey, make your own decision based off of this.
Yes, so they said, we couldn't verify everything in this document. This document has been discussed by the president with incoming president. This document is circulating right now. Senators have seen this document. So I'm going to share it with you, even though I can't verify everything in it. Yep.
It has a lot to do with the first obligation to the truth. For example, I mean, it's a fact that the dossier exists and that people have read it.
Right.
And that is a form of truth,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the fact that everything inside it is true. And then the discipline of verification might come in and like, are you under obligation to actually verify everything someone says, or just to print things that people say as a factual statement of they said this?
Right. It's definitely circulating. It's definitely a document. They could verify that part. People did, though, have different news values on this. Some people said, our brand is if we report it, we have a high confidence that what is said here is true. So there are different variations on that. Independent of those they cover, how might that be violated on cable news? Independent of those they cover. Or what's another way that you can think of journalists not being independent of those they cover? Yeah.
Possibly the person who owns that network has specific political leanings, and based on that, there might be skewed sort of coverage.
Oh, okay. So that is very interesting that you're pointing out that some media companies are controlled by individuals or families, and that's something that we're going to look at across time. In the 1980s in the United States, there were two industries where individual or family ownership were predominant: sports franchises and media outlets, because in both of those you got psychic income for serving your community, being famous in your community. So the president has said that the Washington Post is influenced by whom? Jeff Bezos, right? And other people might say that a cable channel is influenced by whom? Rupert Murdoch, right? So these are all empirical questions. I have not verified them. I have different probabilities on my agreement with both of those statements. But another way to think about it, it's great. I said independence, you said ownership. I can also think of it as your repeat interaction with your sources. If somebody's coming on your show and you're talking to that person frequently, and when you talk to that person frequently, your ratings go up, how hard are you going to push them? How hard are you going to push them in questioning? Does your unwillingness to burn your relationship affect your own independence? And that can be related to power. A lot of what we're going to be looking at in this course involves investigative reporting, Investigative reporting often looks at the delegation of power, decisions that are transferred to somebody else, the people that are supposed to make the choices you would make if you faced that decision. So, what institutions would you like to see held accountable to you? And for the purposes of this question, let's not talk about Washington. Okay? So what's an institution that you would like to see held accountable to you? You would like to see a journalist study how that institution operates and hold them accountable. Yes?
Stanford.
Stanford, the one who writes my paycheck. Yes, okay. Stanford, what would you like to know about Stanford? Stanford University, 501c3 nonprofit.
Where they're spending their money, with how they're developing policies, who they're hiring, etc.
Yes, okay. Policies, money, who they're hiring. Who would you like to do that? Who would you like to hold Stanford accountable?
Probably a combination of people, but partially students, I would say.
Okay. So you would like student outlets, perhaps through an email? Yeah, maybe with a neat name. Hold them accountable, or maybe someplace with a really nice building, right? The Stanford Daily. So Fountain Hopper, Stanford Daily, you'd like them to do that. Okay, so that definitely is true. And we've also talked about you live in a locality. You might care about Palo Alto. Some of you might venture beyond the bubble and care about how police operate in Palo Alto, police in Menlo Park. Forum for public criticism. How does that operate? Forum for public criticism. How do journalism outlets offer you a forum for public criticism? Yeah.
Providing a platform for the public, certainly in opinion sections, perhaps with staff columnists, but also with op-eds, with opportunities for public submission.
That's great. So that's right. It could be your op-eds, it could be your columns. It might be your comment section, potentially, though you definitely want to look at the social science on the representation of comments. But a forum for public criticism, one thing you would want to do if you were running a journalism organization is to make sure your audience knew the difference between breaking news, analysis, news interpretation, op-ed, and columns, especially on social media, because those things can get blurred. Interesting and relevant. Why, when you're trying to figure out the elements of journalism, why would they say you have to be interesting and relevant? Yeah.
Because if you're not interesting and relevant, then no one's going to read it, and so why did you write it?
Yes, you're a diarist, right? I mean, if you don't care if you're reaching people, there was a phrase in Sesame Street, you have to reach before you teach. That's why Elmo is so interesting, okay? You have to think about what will people do? Will they read it? And what that may do is it may mean that you put the most important facts first, or that you put a headline that catches somebody's eye. Studies of Google News show that 40% of the people never click through or don't click through when they visit Google News. They're just news grazers. They look at the title. So the interesting and relevant means if you think you have an obligation to citizens, an obligation to reach them, you better be interesting and relevant. Exercising your own personal conscience. When could that get you in trouble in a media organization? It might get you a movie, right? It might get you Dustin Hoffman or Robert Redford or Tom Hanks. Many different people may end up playing you. But on the personal conscience, when could that come into play? Yes?
I think the Me Too movement is an interesting example
Mm-hmm.
of that, like when journalistic organizations choose to subject people to scrutiny when this gets back to the verification question, verifying allegations. Ronan Farrow, or supporters of Brett Kavanaugh this week,
Sure.
have come at Ronan Farrow for not finding enough eyewitnesses, but then the New Yorker still published the story, and so those were just different editorial calls that were made.
Yeah, so it's interesting on the personal conscience. How would personal conscience enter into Me Too coverage? Because you could say Me Too coverage holds people to account. You could say Me Too coverage is significant and relevant. It could drive ratings. It could tell you the truth about something. You would work hard to verify it. Where would a journalist's personal conscience come into that, if at all? Yes?
Well, with a lot of these cases, high executives at news organizations are being accused of stuff or coming under scrutiny, and so I just think that opens the door to a lot of conflict, whether it's CBS wanting to cover themselves in a certain way or anything like that. So
That's a great example. Do you write about people above the food chain? Do you write about your bosses? And do you write about your own organization? And if you don't, do you leak it? Do you give it to somebody else with the hope that they will do the story? So definitely personal conscience involved there. Finally, rights and responsibilities of citizens. It's the last one they talk about. What rights do you think you have when it comes to the news? When we talk about the news, we've been talking about the market, we've been talking about tabloids, but how does it get back to rights that you have or responsibilities that you have? Yeah.
Right to be informed.
Okay, a right to be informed. So that's something that we'll look at later in the course about the First Amendment. Is the First Amendment about somebody's right to speak, or is it also about somebody's right to hear? Two different ways of viewing the property right. And how about the right to be forgotten? What is the right to be forgotten? It's not ghosting. What is the right to be forgotten? Pretend we're in the EU. What would that mean? Anybody? Yeah.
It's the right to have your presence removed from social media and other kinds of sites.
Yes. So if we were in the EU, there is a right to be forgotten. Particularly, it might relate to something you did that was covered in the media, and Google search. If a Google search is done on your name, that pops up. And you can now, under EU, petition Google and say, that's no longer relevant, that's not me, and Google will make a decision about that. And if you are a financial advisor, and this deals with a financial crime 10 years ago, they're not going to break the link. They say, no, that is still you, and it's still relevant for people. But, and this was the example people used to use until 2 weeks ago, if you said that was me in high school, it's not relevant, then they probably would delink it. Now, they don't expunge it. It just means that when Google does the search, it's not going to offer it to you. If you still went to that news website and knew what to search for, you could find it there. Yes?
Does that also relate to false light?
To what?
False light, that when you're presented a false light.
Right. You could contest something and say, yeah, you could also petition on that basis too. So, why did I talk about that? It seems simple. Perspectives on American journalism. We want to start off by saying, well, what do you mean by journalism? I'm going to ask Anna now to hand out the syllabus. What we're going to do is briefly walk through the overview for the class, what questions we're going to be covering. Now, if you are registered for the class, you would have already probably seen the syllabus. The syllabus is available on the Canvas website. Canvas website is how I will always communicate with you. But on the first day of class, we have some people who haven't registered, so I like to hand out paper. But this will probably be the last paper you see in the class. So I've organized the class around a series of questions. They're questions because journalism markets are changing so rapidly. What I try to do is use current controversies, current challenges. So first set of questions we're going to look at are, what are the economics of news? This week we're going to talk about the supply side. Next week we're going to talk about the demand side. Already a person in the class has raised the question, what's the difference between what people might want to know and what they might need to know? looking at how that question is answered is going to be something that we'll look at through the economics of news. And when I say news, it's news in the many different ways you live your life. So news about your life as a consumer, as a worker, as an audience member, and as a voter. That's a way that we're going to look at the different information demands people have. Next up, we're going to look at what's the story. What's the story is really an examination of product differentiation, how you distinguish a story from another story, a journalist from another journalist, a news outlet from another news outlet. So at the story level, how is what you're going to say different from all the other takes, all the different ways people are covering something? At the journalist level, if I say to you a particular name, like Gail Collins writes for New York Times. If I say Tom Friedman, he writes for, this is going to be a problem. That's what I read every day. If I said Sean Hannity, okay, and Stanford alumna on MSNBC at 9 o'clock, okay, right. So you have in your own mind where people are, what their outlet is, maybe how they are different from other people. That's something we're going to be studying at the story level. And each week we're going to use a chapter from my book, Democracy's Detectives, to look at these. So we'll look at the economics of investigative reporting, types of investigative stories that got told. How is the news supported? So the book that we'll be using, Democracy's Detectives, it's about investigative reporting. Democracy doesn't write a check, right? If I say Democracy's Detectives, it sometimes implies you get hired to do something. But the public interest doesn't knock on your door and say, here's $20 million. Unless you were thinking about Craig Newmark yesterday. So Craig Newmark of Craigslist, he gave $20 million yesterday to two journalists, formerly of ProPublica, to start an outlet called The Markup. The Markup will be writing about our local neighborhood, Silicon Valley. They'll be writing about algorithms, bias, how tech operates. If you are interested in a career in journalism, and I know at least 11 of you are because you're in the MA journalism program, The Markup might be someplace that you might end up working down the road. But Craig doesn't knock on your door every day. The public interest doesn't knock on your door every day. So we're going to try to figure out, how does the news get supported? How does the news get produced? There we're going to look at things like the number of days it takes to do a major investigation. Spoiler alert, when I look at about 12,000 investigations over 30 years, the answer is 6 months. So it can take a long time to do a major investigation. How frequently are government documents used? So July 2016, I'm not sure where you were, but I was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Freedom of Information Act. And not only was I celebrating it, but so was Congress. They passed a law to improve FOIA. One of the things that we're going to look at is, how do you pull information out of the government, especially at the federal level, to do stories? What's the impact of news, particularly investigations? So it could be deliberative. Sometimes when an investigation is published, it starts discussion or it sparks another investigation. Sometimes the impact is individual. Somebody goes to jail, or maybe you pull somebody out of jail who was put there unjustly. So sometimes it generates broader social discussions. Sometimes it generates an impact on a specific person. And sometimes it is substantive in the sense that you get a new law or you get a new policy. In the 12,000 investigations I looked at that have been submitted to the Investigative Reporters and Editors Association over a 30-year time period, about 1% of the time you got a new policy from telling an investigative story. One of the things we'll do in the class is we'll look at how you could take cost-benefit analyses. the things that are used by the federal government in the Office of Management and Budget, how you can do that and quantify and put a dollar value on the impact of an investigation. And we'll go through 3 separate case studies in that part of the course that suggest that for each dollar you spend on an investigation, you can get several $100s in net policy benefits from the change that comes about in society. How is the news distributed? Well, let's think about this. The people who once sat in these seats, who once were students at Stanford, they founded Google, Instagram, Snapchat, WhatsApp, and things that are so current I don't even use them or know them yet. They have a huge impact on how the journalism reaches people. So that's something we're going to spend an entire week on. We're going to talk about how stories are created, how they're produced. But a key thing in today's world is, how does it get to you? So we're going to spend a whole week on how the news gets to you through platforms. Then we're going to look at a new field called computational journalism. It's a really clunky term. It's evolving. I think it's going to be defined by the set of skills or tools that journalists use. I think of it, computational journalism, as stories by, through, and about algorithms. Stories by, through, and about algorithms. So stories by algorithm. 2 great companies, Automated Insights, Narrative Science, they write stories by algorithm for you now. They do it in finance. So the Associated Press has collaborated with Automated Insights, and each time quarterly earnings reports come out in a press release, the data is extracted, and Associated Press gets an automated story from it. Also done with sports stories now. Stories through. How could you use algorithms to discover the story? Atlanta Journal-Constitution several years ago was a Pulitzer finalist by using machine learning. How did they do that? They wanted to ask the question, how frequently are doctors who are accused of sexual harassment or sexual abuse allowed to continue to practice? What they did was they did a web scraper, scraped all 50 states' medical societies. They got over 100,000 cases that looked like it might be doctors who are involved in sexual harassment or abuse. They then used machine learning to collapse that to about 6,000 cases. What did they do? They estimated the probability that a case was about that topic using key terms. And then they read all 6,000 of those. And then they wrote a story about nationwide the pattern of doctors involved in sexual abuse who are allowed to still practice. And they did a Pulitzer finalist. So algorithms write stories for us now in finance and sports and real estate. Algorithms help you find a story. That's what I was just talking about in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And you can write a story about algorithms. That's what ProPublica has been doing. That's a nonprofit based in New York. That's what the Wall Street Journal has been doing. That's what we had students in a class here do last year. The basic idea is, can you go inside an algorithm and see how it's operating? Facebook is notoriously hard to write about. If you've ever been there, you've probably signed a non-disclosure agreement and can't even tell me that you've been there. If you think about how ProPublica investigated Facebook, about 2 years ago, several reporters at ProPublica wanted to look at the advertising algorithm of Facebook. If they had gone at it directly, it would have been difficult because advertising algorithms are a trade secret. That's the secret sauce, and Facebook doesn't want to be gamed. They don't want to tell you how their advertising algorithm works. So if you're a reporter, what could you do? Well, you could say, I want to place an ad for housing-related services, but I don't want you to show it to African Americans. Now, if you had said that human to human, that would never have been placed. If you'd gone to a newspaper, they would not have taken the ad because that violates the Fair Housing Act. But at Facebook, it's algorithm to algorithm, and Facebook said fine. And they took that ad, even though it violates the Fair Housing Act. So ProPublica started to look at all the different ways that you could place ads that might be illegal. So there are debates about the particular laws that are being violated. There are settlement agreements being negotiated right now. If you go back to classified ads, something that probably, has anybody placed a classified ad in a newspaper? Probably only the people 57 or older have done that. So classified ads used to say help wanted male, help wanted female. All the job ads were segregated by gender. Civil Rights Act 1964 made that illegal. Could no longer do that. However, on social media platforms, a couple years ago, you could say, only show this ad to men, only show this ad to women, only show this ad to people 18 to 34. And why would that be a hard story to write about? Why, if a newspaper did it, you could see it, but if Facebook did it, you couldn't? Why is that a hard story? Yeah?
Because the targeting mechanisms are internal to Facebook, they're not external to the newspaper.
Yeah. So you don't really know. When you see an ad, now sometimes when you see an ad, you can click, right, and they'll tell you why you saw that ad. And ProPublica is starting to crowdsource that. People are sharing the ads that they're being shown. And so sometimes in the ad, it'll say you're being shown this because you are a man or a woman between 18 or 34. But that's hard to write about. That's algorithmic accountability. That's something that is starting to be pursued in the area called computational journalism. Finally, the last class is going to say, what impact can a single reporter have? We're going to look at the life of one reporter, Pat Stiff. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner from North Carolina. He worked for over 30 years as an investigative reporter. And in his over 30 years of investigative reporting, he got 31 laws passed in the state of North Carolina. He had a huge impact. So we're going to look at the impact that he had as a reporter, and that's going to segue into thinking about the impact that you might be able to have if you chose to be a reporter. So that's the course overview. How are stories discovered, produced, distributed, funded, impact? And we're going to approach that through asking a question each week and looking at current controversies. If you turn to the front of the syllabus, I want to go over course mechanics. So I view this as the student contract, where I sort of set forth the expectations in the class. So the class is electronics free. So if you brought a cell phone or a laptop, this should be the last time that it's open today, because the whole class will be electronics free. Why? A couple of reasons. Negative externalities, negative spillovers. If you are taking notes and then you're also on Facebook, the person behind you is going to be distracted. We have a lot of research on that. I once did a teaching evaluation at a journalism school, not here, where I sat in the back. It was one of the most depressing experiences. The teacher was phenomenal. And I watched a student watch a video on how to wash your hair. I could not think of a more useless video to me than how to wash your hair. So I'm going to ask you, no laptop, no cell phones, and no eating. Why no eating? Because I get hungry if I watch you eat, okay? This is lunchtime. Feel free to bring beverages, bring caffeine. I've got a monotone, so that's fine. You can bring in drinks, but no food. No food. Oh, and don't arrive late because of the design of the classroom. Don't leave early, and don't watch the discussion unfold. Hopefully, when I ask questions, you will participate. On Tuesday, there will be a lecture in this room every week. On Thursdays, we're going to split the class up. I will take the graduate students, or if you're enrolled for 225, COMM 225, we'll be meeting in School of Education, room 210, and the undergraduates will be meeting in room 208 in the School of Education with the section leader, Anna Gibson. Anna, could you stand up, raise your hand? Okay.
Me from syllabuses.
Yes, that's right. So Anna is going to be leading the discussion on Thursdays. And She's going to introduce herself right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Anna Gibson. I've seen a lot of you guys before. So I'm a rising fourth-year PhD student in the communication department. It is a joy to be able to TA for this class. I don't usually work in journalism, so I am really excited to learn what you guys know, and you guys can help me learn more about journalism, and it'll be lots of fun.
Excellent. Great. Okay. Thank you. So that's our Tuesday, Thursday plan. In terms of grading, 20% class participation on Tuesdays and Thursdays, 15% each for the 750-word essays you're going to write. So every other week, I'll ask you to write an essay in response to a prompt that I'll give you. So if your last name begins with A through L, your papers are going to be due on the October 9th, 23rd, November 6th. This is all on the syllabus, front page. If your last name begins with M through Z, your paper is going to be due on October 16th, 30th, and November 13th. I'm an economist. I respect trade-offs, so you can turn the paper in late, but there is a price. There's a penalty. It's 1 grade step per day. So if you turn a paper in 1 day late, the A- goes to a B+, and a new day starts at midnight. So the papers are due at start of class. So if you turn it in at 9 p.m., that's 1 day. If you turn it in 3 a.m., that's 2 days. You can miss 1 class meeting without affecting your participation grade. And then the final paper, 8 pages, due December 7th, 4 p.m. That's 35% of your grade. But I'll hand out the prompt in November, so you will have plenty of time to work on it. Yes?
When will the prompts for the reading response papers come out?
For the response papers? Yeah, they'll be at least a week ahead of time. Okay, yeah, so you always have a week ahead of time to do that. Also, that's a great question. The responses will be in the memos that I post on Canvas. Before class, I always post a memo. So obviously last week I posted for today. I've already posted today for next week's class. And in that memo will be the prompt, and I'll also have reading questions as a way to guide yourself through the readings. So the course is designed for you to do the readings before Tuesday's class, for you to engage with the readings and discussion on Thursdays, for you to write something every other week, and for you to turn in an 8-page paper at the end that allows you to go deeper. Those are the mechanics of the class. Any questions about those? Any uncertainty? Okay. Now what I want to talk about a little bit is your interests and my interests. So I'm going to ask Anna to hand out a sheet. This is where I learned a little bit about why you're here, not in an existential sense, but why you're in this class, what you're particularly interested in. And I'll also tell you how I ended up here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to fill this out, but before I ask you to fill it out, anybody not have this? Okay. So how did I get here? What are my interests? Essentially, I'm a PhD in economics. I started off by studying environmental policy. I started off by looking at how pollution affects people and how information revelation about pollution affects company behavior. So the first 10 years of my professional life, I was an environmental economist, studying in part the cleanup of hazardous waste facilities. I wrote my dissertation on environmental equity, the siting of hazardous waste facilities in low-income minority areas. I wrote a book about something called the Toxics Release Inventory, which is about pollution behavior. One day I read that Congress was considering publishing a violent television report card that would tell you who was advertising on violent TV. And the parallels between the EPA publishing information about pollution and the government potentially publishing information about advertising and TV violence led me to write a book about the market for television violence called Channeling Violence, The Economics of Television Violence. That got me a lot of interviews where people wanted me to criticize the media for producing violent images. I wanted to say, and I often did say, I do think that some images are harmful and that there are too many violent programs, but I think the biggest market failure is what we have too little of, public affairs coverage. Those of you who've had microeconomics, TV violence or pollution is a negative spillover. The market doesn't lead you to incorporate all the damage when you produce television violence. Public affairs coverage involves positive spillovers, positive externalities. You aren't fully rewarded in the marketplace for doing that. So after writing a book that people use to criticize the media, I wanted to write a book that would show a different type of problems. So it was called All the News That's Fit to Sell, How the Market Turns Information into News. That book led me to work and participate in studies with the Federal Trade Commission. I worked at the Federal Communications Commission for a year and a half as a consultant on a project called the Information Needs of Communities. That report was 400 pages long, and it only used the word market failure once in a footnote because they forgot to take it out. They agreed with the logic of market failure, but they didn't want to use the term market failure because they were afraid if they said markets were failing, that might imply a government response, and they didn't want to be on the hook for that. I don't think that the statement the market fails to produce sufficient or optimal amounts of public affairs coverage implies that the government is necessarily the solution. But I was struck by the set of people I was working with at the FCC who basically believed the public interest is defined by the public's interest. That's a direct quote from one of the FCC commissioners from the 1980s. That same commissioner said, TV is just a toaster with pictures. And by that he meant there's nothing special about television. There's nothing special about the market for information. And in fact, one of the FCC commissioners, Michael Powell, on his first day on the job was asked about the digital divide. And he said, I think there's a Mercedes divide. I'd like one, but I can't afford it. So that image that there's nothing special about information markets, that they work just like any other market, I rejected that based on the studies that I'd done. But I wrote a book to try to outline my logic, and that book was called Democracy's Detectives. That's what we'll be talking about in this class. Essentially what I tried to show in that book is develop a statistical argument that says, here is why a story is costly, can have high net benefits to society, but doesn't pass a market test. Because when you change a law, the benefits can spill over onto many people who are not your readers or subscribers, so you don't get fully rewarded for that impact. So that was the origin. I came to Stanford after 20 years at Duke, working in a public policy school, because I was very interested in the development of this field, computational journalism. I helped found the Stanford Computational Journalism Lab, where we're focused on two questions. How do you lower the cost of discovering stories with better use of data and algorithms? And how do you tell stories in more personalized or engaging ways? So a supply approach and a demand approach. In October, we're going to be announcing something called the Stanford Journalism and Democracy Initiative. That's going to bring together the Knight Fellows, the journalism program, and the Brown Institute over at the School of Engineering. And we're going to be offering more courses, more research projects, including one called Big Local News. So if you're interested in local news or if you're interested in applying CS skills to social challenges, that's something that may interest you. And one of the speakers we're bringing to campus is Bob Woodward. You may know he has a book out these days, and he's going to be here talking November 8th. This morning, I sent you a link to the ability to register for seeing Bob Woodward on November 8th. But that's how I ended up here. What I'd like to know is more about you. In particular, what I'd like to know are the following. A frustration I have with news markets is X, and one thing I find puzzling about news markets is Y. So take a minute, write down what are you frustrated by in terms of the news, and what do you find puzzling? And then we're going to talk about it. So frustration and a puzzle. Okay, let's start first with frustration. What are you frustrated by in news markets? Yes?
One thing that I've become frustrated with is the idea that I kind of know that I'm in an echo chamber, but at the same time, I can't stand to break out of it, and it feels more like worse and worse every day.
That's dark. Okay. So the frustration you have is being in an echo chamber, realizing that might happen, but not taking the individual action to pull yourself out. When news once came on paper, there was a serendipity factor where you had to go through a part of the paper to get to another paper. That was one way that you were exposed to things you might not even know you were interested in. There's an interesting startup out of Japan called Smart News, which tries to give you information that is relevant to you, but they have a serendipity algorithm that they program in to try to think, maybe you don't know this, but we bet you're interested. A related point to that on the algorithm, though, how many false positives would you tolerate before you get angry at the serendipity algorithm? In the example they use, suppose you don't like to watch Fox News, and the serendipity algorithm shows you Fox News once, you tolerate it. It shows it to you 2 days in a row, and you get frustrated. So there's an interesting thing with trying to get you to break out. On the echo chamber, that's a statistical question to investigate. If you go back maybe 5 years ago and look at the Facebook algorithm, they were looking at self-identified liberals and conservatives on Facebook and the information they shared. One of the results they seemed to find was that 1 out of 4 news stories came from an outlet of a different ideology than your own. And so then assuming that were true, and the Facebook algorithm changes over time, assuming that were true 1 out of 4, some people read that study and said, victory, 1 out of 4, you're not in an echo chamber. And the other people said, 3 out of 4, defeat, you're in an echo chamber. So it's an interesting thing when you ask yourself, how much of it is, how much diversity would you tolerate? It turned out that a lot of it depended in part on who your friends were and what they were sharing with you. Okay, echo chamber, yeah.
I think especially recently, I feel like there's been an increase in uncertainty regarding biases that certain news outlets have. I think maybe just because of the political space that we're in right now, it seems like a lot of people think that maybe certain news outlets are biased in a right-wing or left-wing way. And I think that for me at least, that becomes really frustrating when I'm trying to have a conversation that's constructive with someone that has different political beliefs than me, because if one of us brings up an idea or a fact, it can be questioned as like, well, is that from a biased news source? So the basic facts and figures of what you're talking about can be contested or written off as biased.
Yes, there was a senator who said everybody gets his own opinions, but not his own facts. So you're frustrated in part by, if everything is appearing biased, what's our common ground that we can discuss? An interesting thing about bias, if I asked you to put yourself on a liberal conservative scale of 1 to 7, and then I asked you to evaluate different outlets, I could predict what you would say was biased by the average ideology of that consumer. So if we think of ourselves as on a spatial model, to an economist, bias could be product differentiation. So there are a set of outlets who, if you ask them, what are the important things to talk about today in government? They might say too much regulation, immigration, pro-life, pro-choice. If you ask another set of people, what would you say are the most important questions to talk about today? They might say income inequality, immigration again, pro-life, pro-choice. The way that you frame what's important and what stories you tell, all of them could be accurate, but how you try to say this is important, this is not important, that can be product differentiation. So bias could be, we all have different views of the world and we like to consume what reflects our viewpoint. Bias can also be, let's depoliticize this, let's go back to Richard Nixon. Okay, one of the nice things about studying Richard Nixon's presidency is that he taped himself and he wrote memos. And all of those are available at the National Archives now. So Richard Nixon, he had his vice president, Spiro Agnew, attack the media in much the same wording that we hear today as biased. But what Nixon said on the tapes and said in memos is, we need to delegitimize the media because when I run for re-election, I want people to doubt what the media has to say. So it's an explicit strategy to criticize the media in the Nixon administration. Also in the Nixon administration, it became helpful to raise questions about institutions, call them elite, call them liberal, because that played well with their marginal voter. So if we go back to history, number one, we can see there are reasons why people try to undermine the press that have to do with re-election concerns. And number two, bias can be product differentiation. Okay? Other things that people find frustrating. Yes?
Continued reliance on an advertising model that incentivizes quantity over quality.
Yes, so continued reliance on the advertising model. If you think about advertising, there's a great book by Edwin Baker about the biases of advertising funded media. Essentially, advertising doesn't care how much you enjoyed the piece of content, just if you saw it. So to an advertiser, they're trying to get your attention. They don't care if you really enjoyed something, just if you saw it. And advertising is also biased against the preferences of a statistical minority. So if a preference for a particular media content is not held by a large number of people, the fixed cost of creating that content may mean that their interests are not served. So there are problems, economic problems with advertising-supported media, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So far, I'm using economics to tell you in different words, yes, your frustrations are valid. Other frustration? Yeah. Yes, Fabian.
The fact that newsrooms keep shrinking, which means that people are forced into freelancing while that is grossly underpaid, which means that newsrooms have less time and people to cover important issues, especially local ones, and B, that all these freelance journalists don't have the time, they can not fully devote their time to that journalism.
That's 4 weeks in the class. I think you're exactly right. So you're talking about the basically the employment of journalists. The numbers have gone down, maybe 40% since 2008. We don't know exactly in newspapers because they stopped doing the survey. It was so depressing. So we don't have an exact count on that. And then you're talking about hiring freelancing. Gig economy now is coming to journalists, one-offs, trying to do that. That's something to be frustrated about, and we'll look at that during the class. How about a puzzle? Yes?
It's interesting because over the past decade, some media outlets have really read the market well and really kind of changed their business models, while others just kind of lag behind and kind of fail to respond until it's too late. And so kind of just how some outlets have been able to notice those changes ahead of time and others have failed to do so, how those companies differ, I think is interesting.
That's great. So winners and losers. I actually had a student from last year who now works for a private equity firm that invests in media companies. And he wrote me last night an email about using the ideas in this class because he's trying to spot people to make a bet on in terms of business models. So why are there winners? Why are there losers? And ex ante, could you have predicted whom was whom? So that's great. Winners, losers. Yeah.
The demise of factual journalism. So is this something that is current? Are there checks and balances that are failing? Is it driven by digital media channels? Or is this just something that has always happened and we're just seeing it differently?
Oh, that's okay. So that's great. So it's what's the incidence of fact-based journalists? More under pressure now than in the past. And are there more opportunities? I've been involved in something called ClaimsBuster, which is software from UT Austin, mostly from Duke University. What they're able to do is take the transcript of a presidential debate or State of the Union, and when a statement is being made, compare it against a database of fact checks. So you get a pop-up video effect of actually having the fact check presented while the person, right after it is said. And then you have to make sure to get your things synced up because sometimes there's a delay. And one of the first times it was checked was on a State of the Union, and there was a delay with what the public was seeing. So the fact check was showing before the president made the misstatement. So you definitely want to, because of the lag. So Definitely fact-checking under siege. Are there ways, though, that you can use technology to actually lower the cost of fact-checking? So that's something that we're definitely going to look at. One more puzzle? One more puzzle? Yes?
What the future of print is, there's a recurring theme in the readings about digital first and then better print.
Yeah.
20 years down the line, what will that look like? And then I guess that dovetails into the idea of the trade-off between publications' pressure to break stories and their commitment to include nuance and accuracy.
Yes.
Does the one come with digital at the outset, and then is print a place for more substantial content in the aftermath?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at. The print used to arrive as a bundle on your doorstep, right? And then the disruption of the internet means that the sections were put on line, and so it no longer made sense to have a full bundle. But you're trying, I think, to say, what role would print have? Is it going to be newspapers, or is it going to be magazines? Is it going to be experience? Is it going to be only a high-quality outlet rather than breaking news and the other things that we'll expect online? That's something that we'll definitely spend a large fraction of the class on. Frustrations, puzzles. Can I start to give you a theory? So let's think about the supply side. I think almost every question you ask could be put in a supply and demand framework. If we think about the supply incentive, why do people create information for you? I think there are 5 supply incentives. Number 1, I want to sell your attention to somebody else. I want to sell your attention to somebody else. That's the advertising model. Number 2, pay me. That's subscription. You want information? Pay me, I'll give it to you. 3, nonprofit. I want to change how you think about the world. I want to change how you think about the world. Or I want your vote. That's partisan. Or I just like to talk. That is expression. So to me, those are the 5 incentives that lead people to generate information for you. What we're seeing, and some of this was reflected in the questions that you raised today, what we're seeing is a reweighting of these different incentives. A reweighting in part because Google and Facebook are stellar at advertising. And advertising dollars are fleeing from newspapers, from print newspapers, and going to Facebook and Google. So that's leading some people, let's say the New York Times, to switch to subscription. So you see a reweighting. Sometimes a reweighting means more nonprofit. All of these have a bias implicit in them. And what I mean by bias, maybe you treat the ideas and interests of people differently depending on who they are. Treating the ideas and interests of people differently depending on who they are. All of those have a bias in them. So what you're really doing is trading off the biases. I just published a paper in August, co-authored paper with Fiona Morgan. Think about how those supply incentives react towards the interests of low-income people. Advertising. People with low income may not be the marginal consumer. You may not be trying to change their mind, so you may not create content to attract them. Subscription. Government data indicate that low-income individuals spend less on information, less likely to subscribe. They have another set of bills that they need to pay, utility bills, rent bills. Nonprofit, less likely to be donors. Maybe you won't talk about their interests. Partisan, this one is particularly depressing. With the advent of online campaign targeting, campaigns are now not speaking to people because they don't think they're going to vote. In the old days, if you were showing an ad on television, voters and non-voters got it. Now, if I'm targeting on Facebook, if I don't think you're going to vote, I may not even give you any information. In expression, there are a whole set of people who don't have broadband at home. They may not be part of this digital conversation and expression. All of these also have a policy component. Advertising. FTC can have guidelines that affect privacy. Essentially, if you're talking about advertising-supported media, a price you're paying, it appears to be fee, but a price you're paying is you give up some of your privacy in order for them to target you better with advertising. Subscription, that can be affected by copyright. Should news aggregators be able to take your headline or maybe even the first page, not first page, first line of your story and use that as fair use? So how we treat copyright affects people's ability to charge subscriptions. Nonprofits, should the IRS give nonprofit status to websites that cover local news? Should you be able to say, I'm a news provider, therefore I should get nonprofit status? That was a particularly controversial issue. Partisan, campaign finance guidelines, campaign finance laws. Should you be able to know who is funding a particular outlet or particular donation? And expression, should the FCC provide subsidies for broadband to increase the set of people who are participating in conversations? So when you step back and say, you're frustrated, you have puzzles, the good news is there are some things that can help you think about this strategically and consistently. This week we're going to be focused on the supply incentives. Next week we're going to be focused on the demand side. So on Thursday you should come to class prepared to discuss the readings and the reading questions that I offered as prompts. So that was the first lecture for COMM 125, 225, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday.